Hello, everyone. My name is Christine von Kalnitz. I'm the Sustainability and Energy Manager at the Medical University of South Carolina. And welcome to our Conversation Cafe. Today's topic is decarbonization in South Carolina. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about MUSC sustainability. So we want to build healthy communities by inspiring and implementing solutions to environmental, social, and economic challenges. And these are some of the initiatives that we're working on, one of which is to save energy, and that is, you can see the Holy Spoke bike there, and that is an MUSC sponsored system, and you can ride those bikes all over town, and MUSC employees can ride those for free. So if you haven't signed up as an MUSC employee, go online and sign up, and you can take bikes out for free. All right, wanted to let everyone know during the presentation, you can check the chat. We will be putting in links to our newsletter sign up and our social media and our Yammer. So get online there, and if you have questions, please put your questions also in the chat, and we will have a Q&A during the presentation. Okay, I'm going to pass this to Rachel Beck. She is also on the call. She is our intern.
Hi everyone, I'm Rachel. I'm the intern here at MUSC Sustainability. I've just put in the chat all of the links that Christine was just mentioning, so you can just easily click to follow our newsletter or our social media. We do this Conversation Cafe event once a month. So next month, our theme is going to be Heat in a Low Country Oasis. So stay tuned for that by following us on social media. And for this presentation, this event, Conversation Cafe, it is on energy decarbonization in South Carolina. So our guest speakers include Heather Pohan from Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, or SACE. And next we will have Zarin Mitchell from Dominion Energy. So without any further ado, I'll pass it over to Heather first.
My name is Heather Pohan. I'm with the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy. Thanks for having me here today. I'm excited to join Zarin Mitchell from Dominion, and looking forward to having a insightful conversation about decarbonization in South Carolina. So for those of you who aren't familiar with SACE, SACE is a regional nonprofit organization that works in the Southeast to promote responsible and equitable energy choices to ensure clean, safe, and healthy communities throughout the Southeast. And so we do that in a couple of different ways. One of those ways is utility advocacy. So a pretty big part of my job is working to advocate for the inclusion of more solar, wind, storage, energy efficiency in utility resource plans. Utilities are regulated by state regulators called public service commissions that help kind of decide the energy mix. And where we get our energy is possibly one of the most impactful things in people's day-to-day lives that they probably haven't heard of or don't even necessarily think about that often. And so another part of SACE's work is demystifying to the best of our ability that resource process and where we get our energy choices, and demystifying that to communities and residents so that they can get involved. So that that can be at state utility commissions, but in many cases, and also in South Carolina, that's state legislatures or even local cities and municipalities. So anyways, I'm going to try to go through the who, what, when, where, why of decarbonization as best as I can. So starting off with who needs to decarbonize. One way of thinking about the who is by sector. So sector is just kind of another way of saying who is the end user of fossil fuels. And so this chart is showing that information for South Carolina over the past couple of decades. So one thing that you can notice is that the electric power sector, or electric utilities, and the transportation sector are two of the largest components. And they've been playing jump rope a little bit the past couple of years, but transportation is now the largest. So obviously gasoline used for cars, as well as diesel for heavy duty trucks and jet fuel for planes. But I really do want to call attention to the electric power line that you're seeing. So one thing that you can notice is that it's dropping very sharply, a lot faster than transportation is going up. And so that is in large part because of the types of fuels that power plants are using. And that's really just a huge key part of decarbonization, because electric utilities can be used to electrify other sectors. So one of the biggest examples is electric vehicles in the transportation sector. Instead of using that gasoline, they can use electricity instead, and it's actually, even if it's still coming from sources that use some carbon, it's actually still quite a bit cleaner. The same goes for the industrial sector, as well as residential and commercial. You may have heard of some recent efforts to change gas stoves to induction stovetops. That's kind of the same principle, but in your home instead of a car. Okay, so moving along, another way to think about the who, again, I'm going to be focusing a lot on electric utilities. So I just decided to quickly highlight a few of the major ones in South Carolina. So obviously Duke and Dominion are the biggest. They are investor-owned utilities, but they do fall under the jurisdiction of the Public Service Commission. And then also state-owned Santee Cooper, I probably won't be talking about as much, but has been in the news a lot due to possible reforms, possibly selling it. I believe the state legislature decided not to do that. But so yeah, just kind of showing them on a map so you can see who they are, and just kind of keep that in mind for when I come back to talk about more specific utilities. Okay. So what is decarbonization? I know this probably should have came a little bit earlier, but decarbonization is basically, I think a lot of you can kind of guess, it's using or emitting less carbon dioxide. So when I talk about decarbonization, I'm just talking about the transition of our power supply to sources that emit lower carbon emissions. Usually it's with the goal of using zero carbon to power all sectors. And again, electric utilities really are just a key tool for decarbonizing other sectors. So I'm just going to quickly highlight a few examples that help illustrate to people who are visual learners. So retiring coal or gas plants is one way to decarbonize. And then of course, using renewables like solar, onshore wind, offshore wind, storage, and energy efficiency up in the upper right-hand corner is also another way. Energy efficiency is also a resource that utilities can invest in, but it's on the demand side instead of the supply side. And then again, electrification of other sectors. I think I've talked about that already. So moving along, I'm going to talk a little bit more about what decarbonization looks like in South Carolina. And so historically, again, the electric power sector has been decarbonizing, and over the past couple of decades, the way that's been done in South Carolina has been mainly fuel switching from coal to gas. So gas is about half of the emissions rates of coal, but it still does, emit quite a bit of CO2. So you can see that even when we're getting to 2030 in this table out there, that the state average for emissions intensity is about 682 pounds of carbon dioxide per megawatt hour. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more in the next slide. Yeah, again, so historically, fuel switching, some nuclear generation, basically kind of holding steady. Solar and energy efficiency have had contributions, but we're going to see a lot more of those in the future than we have seen over the past decade. So looking forward to 2030, that's kind of the time frame that I picked just because that's the time frame that a lot of utility plans cover. And also some utilities have interim decarbonization targets like Duke that they have kind of interim goals between 2030 and 2050. So what we see going forward to 2030 is that the state is going to add a lot more solar. So that's due in part to the Solar Freedom Act that was passed in the state legislature a couple of years ago. We also see quite a bit of efficiency improvements due to recent changes in kind of how the resource process is playing out. And then although a lot of the utilities are going to retire coal, I think you even see some individual utilities retiring their entire fleet by 2030. The impact of those retirements are hindered by rising fossil gas consumption. And so adding more and more gas makes it difficult for the state's emissions rate to get much lower than that of an average gas plant. So keep that in mind as we head on to the next slide. So another way to think about decarbonization is kind of, well, one measure we can look at is the carbon intensity of the power supply. So that's basically showing how many pounds of carbon dioxide are emitted for each megawatt hour of electricity that's produced. So again, different fuels emit different levels of carbon. So I highlighted kind of three things in the middle. One is the Southeast average. So you can see that the Southeast average, the average for Southeast utilities was about 833 pounds per megawatt hour, which is really actually pretty close to the same average of a gas plant that emits using the same measure. We can also see that the South Carolina average is fairly close to that regional average. And just quickly highlighting a couple of utilities that operate in South Carolina. Duke ranks relatively low. I think I forgot to mention this on the map slide, but Duke's utilities that operate in South Carolina also operate in North Carolina. So there is a little bit of power that's transferred in between the states. So yeah, Duke ranks relatively low, while Santee Cooper is much higher. Dominion is higher than average. It's expected to fall, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit in the next slide. But one thing that I also do want to say before we move on is that even though some of these utilities are lower than others, even relatively low emitting utilities can contribute a lot to emissions if they're burning a lot of fossil gas to serve many, many customers. So it's really, it's very important to look at total emissions reductions so we can kind of learn more about kind of how that looks and how that plays out into the time frame of when we need to decarbonize. So to set that up really quickly, we're looking at two time frames. One is again that kind of historical actual from 2010 to roughly to present. How much is decarbonized? Again, it's been very sharp reductions over the past decade, about a 34% total decrease. But going forward, we see that it's pretty notable that the decline in emissions is tapering off in the near future. As opposed to those sharp reductions that we saw in the past. So the historical reductions are pretty steep at 34%, while from 2020 to 2030, it's about half that in terms of the total decrease, and that's during a very similar time frame. So kind of keeping those two timeframes in mind, we're next going to look at how that translates to annual reductions. So kind of taking that 35% and looking at like, okay, that was over 9 years, so that's roughly 4.2% per year for some utilities. And kind of one interesting thing is that you can see that even seemingly small changes or small differences between the average annual reductions, 2.9% versus 2.5 doesn't really sound like that much when you're just looking at it as a number. But when you're translating that into years, basically saying, okay, if a utility is reducing emissions 2.5% every year until they reach zero, how long will that take? And so we can see that there are some utilities that are slowing down, and improvements to resource plans actually really do help, can help utilities change course. So I mentioned earlier that the Solar Freedom Act in South Carolina, and recently a commission order from the South Carolina Utilities Commission requested that Duke kind of redo its, or sorry, not Duke, Dominion redo its latest IRP to include more comprehensive modeling of energy efficiency. And I believe it also added kind of modeling for retiring most of the coal plants by 2030. And so that's kind of, those are two examples of work that SACE has done that has actually translated into kind of a discernible outcome. So I think of those things and I feel pretty positive because that shows that a lot of the utility advocacy that people are doing at the state utility commissions and at the state legislature, those things are working and they have outcomes that really are helping move up the timeline. Okay. So quickly looking at where I wanted to zoom out for a second to look at kind of the different fossil plants that are left in the region. I marked out the top 10 just so you could kind of get an idea of how much they contribute to overall emissions. And these are ranked by basically ones that coal plants that are expected to still be operating in 2030. And so again, I wanted to highlight this just because there are power transfers that happen between states. So for example, there are some emissions figures for South Carolina that look a little low, but that's actually because the state is receiving power from North Carolina, and some of that power is actually generated from coal emissions. And so I just kind of wanted to highlight that because I think it's important to think about the larger regional picture when we're also thinking about South Carolina. So why even bother to reduce emissions? Why do we need to decarbonize? And so I think that this will probably not be news to most people on the call, but the impacts of climate change are happening, they're imminent. And the key guidance from scientists is that we need to limit warming to about 1.5 degrees to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. So over on the right, there are some graphs that are showing, kind of trying to show what the risk looks like. And I highlighted, you can kind of see these boxes here. That's the window between 2.5 degrees and 2 degrees of warming. And you can see that color transition, it's going from orange to red or red to purple, that is really a key window for many of the impacts of climate change that we don't want to see in South Carolina. For instance, more extreme weather events, coastal flooding, impacts to tourism. So, to avoid those things, the key guidance from scientists is to decarbonize, decarbonize basically across all sectors, ideally between 2040 and 2050. However, we also know that at the current rate that it could even be likely to reach that 1.5 degrees warming even in the next decade. So zooming out again, just to kind of reiterate, why we need to decarbonize. There are multiple reasons that have some sort of interaction with climate change, but they also stand on their own as well. So, for instance, on the upper right-hand corner, lowering energy bills. This is really one way that we like to frame energy efficiency, just because energy efficiency is it includes many common things that people are familiar with because they want to lower their energy bills. So for instance, LED light bulbs, high efficiency air conditioning and appliances, air and duct sealing. Those are just very practical reasons that we might want to decarbonize, and energy efficiency is a great way to do that. Another that is relevant to South Carolina is to prevent offshore drilling. In the middle, cleaner jobs, sustainable jobs. Up top, cleaner air and water. I think I heard Christine talk about an upcoming webinar on extreme heat events. So again, in the lower left-hand corner, extreme heat and weather is another thing that we want to avoid, as well as that prevention of coastal flooding. So how do we decarbonize? Solutions exist. There are plenty of technologies that are readily available today. I've mentioned a lot of them. Wind, offshore wind, improved transmission, solar panels on houses, solar farms. Yeah, just all sorts of things. So, and the fact that all those technologies are ready to be deployed now means that we don't need to wait to do these things. Okay, so yeah, how do we decarbonize? Again, there's a number of opportunities that can be used to bend that decarbonization curve down to meet the guidelines that were set out by climate scientists that I mentioned earlier. These are really just a few. As we all know, there's no one-size-fits-all solution to climate change, to decarbonization, but these are just a couple of the important things that I wanted to highlight. So first is electrification. I mentioned briefly earlier, but just reiterating that leveraging a cleaner electric sector to decarbonize other sectors through electrification really would reduce emissions across the economy, and it's a fairly low-hanging fruit as well. Even with the current mix of resources, things like using an electric stove or an electric car are still far, far cleaner than their fossil fuel equivalent. So that's what's possible today. It's only going to get better as the grid gets cleaner and as utilities use less fossil fuels. So below that, electrification, we have resource planning, which is sometimes called integrated resource planning. I think I may have mentioned that a few times, but again, this is a very impactful thing that affects people in their day-to-day lives. This is where utilities make near and long-term resource plans, investment decisions. We at SACE are engaged in this process throughout the Southeast and in South Carolina. And it's really a key opportunity to push for further investments in solar, wind, storage, energy efficiency. Okay. Upper right-hand corner, just transition. This term can encompass a lot of ideas. We're thinking about it in this context, or like where there's this is really an overarching theme for our work, and the changes to kind of the current utility system that we're working within, and that this is also an opportunity to improve on systemic racial, economic, and class disparities, and to try to avoid exacerbating them. So basically, we need to keep in mind how different communities are impacted as we design decarbonization strategies and implement them. And so that's kind of an ongoing process. Then at the bottom right, zooming out quite a bit, so looking at things federally, it's just important to note that federal policy has an outsized impact on the Southeast because the region doesn't have things like a competitive energy market or state renewable portfolio standards in most cases. So what happens at the federal level has a larger impact on states like South Carolina or other parts of the country, has a larger impact on South Carolina than it does in other parts of the country. The region also could benefit just because there's a pretty large manufacturing supply chain in the region. So things like vehicles and electric vehicles, it just increasing that it means that the Southeast is a good place for expansion of that capacity. So I can see I'm running short on time, so I'm just gonna skip this slide and thank you for listening.
Great, thank you so much, Heather. Like I just said in the chat, if anyone has a question at any time, you can just drop it into the chat. We are going to try to answer some questions. So right now we have about 2 minutes for questions. Put your questions in the chat, like I said, but I have one to get us started off, which I will also drop here in the chat. So the question is, how does an electric utilities power supply compare to using gasoline for electric vehicles?
Okay, great question. This is one that we get a lot, and yeah, I mean, it's definitely a question that people have because sometimes they see graphs like the one that I showed earlier, and it has coal on it, and that kind of scares people. But even and I'm going to share my screen again and just use one of my hidden slides since I think it might be a little bit easier. Actually, no, I need to unhide it. Yeah, so one way to think about this is translating that emissions intensity, basically the pounds of CO2 per megawatt hour, into kind of a miles per gallon equivalent. So, a gallon of gasoline burns a set amount of carbon, and we can see that even a coal heavy state like Alabama, that's almost at 1,000 pounds per megawatt hour, basically would be able to go much further, about 80 miles, while burning the same amount of carbon as 1 gallon of gasoline. So, you can think of how far you can get on 1 gallon of gasoline and just know that it's probably not quite 80 miles. And again, that really only gets cleaner over time. I also compared it to 2030, so you can see that, again, like seemingly minute changes from 960 to 810 is a gain of almost 40 gallons or 40 miles. So yeah.
Okay, perfect. All right, just for the sake of time, we're going to pass it over to Zarin right now, and then we'll have about 10 minutes after her presentation as well. So Zarin, you can share your screen and keep dropping your questions into the chat, and we will try to get to them at the end.
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you, Heather, for that great presentation. So my name's Zarin Mitchell, and I am an ESG strategic advisor with Dominion Energy, and I'm really happy to be here to kind of highlight the sustainability efforts of Dominion. For those of you who aren't as familiar with Dominion, we operate in 16 states, and we serve over 7 million customers. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of background, and I think it's really important to kind of highlight, especially given Heather's presentation, the great progress that's been made on the electricity sector. As you can see, the decreasing the emissions, and I'll kind of talk about how the plans that we have going forward are going to help reduce that even more. So when we talk about ESG, we talk about that from a sustainability perspective from Dominion, as the E is obviously environmental, the S is the social component, so that obviously incorporates affordability, and then the G is the governance. So that is really talking about what controls and processes do we have in place from a company perspective to make sure that we're aligned not only from the business units and the operations, but from the corporate strategy going all the way up to the executives and finally the board. So all of those components really make up our sustainability strategy, and they are all related to each other. So when we think of our strategy from a Dominion perspective, we always focus on, the core principles of decarbonization, of reliability, of affordability, and they are all intertwined. So when we talk about Dominion's Energy's commitment to environmental, social, and governance, it's really driven by our belief that the best companies consider the interest of all the stakeholders, including shareholders, employees, customers, and the communities that we serve. And we're always striving to operate in an environmentally responsible manner. And I think that when people think of, electric utilities previously, the core tenets were typically safe, reliable, affordable energy, but really the decarbonization has become a really bigger focus, and I'll kind of talk about how that transition has occurred over the last several years. Oops. So Dominion Energy has made a commitment to be net zero by 2050, and this kind of plays into Heather's presentation before, acknowledging the need for us to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees by 2050. So I think when you talk about how Dominion Energy's corporate enterprise-wide commitment to net zero by 2050 is important, the other thing that's also important, and I think someone brought this up in a chat earlier, is that our net zero commitment not only includes carbon dioxide, but it also includes methane. So when we talk about Dominion Energy's net zero by 2050, our commitment is to be net zero emissions for carbon and methane by 2050, which is important. And the CO2 goal is based off the US plan under the Paris Agreement, which is measured against the 2005 levels. And our methane goal has a baseline from 2010, which was presented by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And we also have interim targets as well, which I think, Heather highlighted the need for companies to not only look long-term, but also to have those interim reduction targets so that people can see the progress that's being made. And it's important for people to be able to understand that it's not just a long-term target, that there's that medium-term target that we're also working to achieve. And so when you think about Dominion Energy, how are we going to do that? Well, Dominion, across our entire footprint, will achieve near-term progress by extending the licenses of our zero-carbon nuclear fleet, rapidly expanding wind and solar, continuing to rely on the low-carbon natural gas, investing in hydrogen and renewable natural gas, and expanding our industry-leading methane emission reductions programs. And over the long term, net zero will require supportive legislative and regulatory policies, technological advancements, and broader investments across the economy. And this includes investments in large-scale battery storage, hydrogen, advanced nuclear, and carbon capture. So I think this also plays into what Heather was talking about before, about how it's not, you really need a lot of pieces working together in order to achieve your goals. And federal regulatory legislative policy is really important in order for us to execute our plans. And then the next slide is really talking about the evolvement of the company. So, when I think of Dominion and I think of the strategic repositioning the company has made, in July of 2020, Dominion Energy announced the sale of substantially all of our gas transmission and storage business. And this strategic repositioning has allowed the company to focus on its state-regulated, sustainability-focused utility operations. It also allows the company to highlight the value of our increasingly green energy profile. And this has been something that's been frequently emphasized by investors and other stakeholders. Much has happened since 2020, beginning with our net zero commitment, obviously the pandemic, and the recent passage of the Virginia Clean Economy Act, which I'll kind of talk about a little further in the next slides, which really help focus on why legislative policies are really important to decarbonization strategies. And our ESG focused strategy has really transformed the company to slash emissions and help our customers and our communities do the same. Again, I'll talk about it a little later about how that we're providing our customers with tools so that they can, evaluate if they did want to go from a gasoline internal combustion engine to an electric vehicle. We're providing them the tools so that they can actually see the impact on the environment. We're developing the largest offshore wind project in the Americas, and we boast the third largest solar portfolio among U.S. utility holding companies. We have the largest pumped hydro facility in the world in Bath County, and we're continuing to invest and explore technologies such as hydrogen and carbon captures. Our financial plans include up to $72 billion on clean energy and clean energy enabling infrastructure over the next 15 years. That'll benefit our 7 million utility customer accounts, representing more than 15 million people and businesses. The largest portion does include Virginia, but it also includes our gas businesses and our investments in South Carolina. So kind of piggybacking off of Heather's previous presentation on policy, I wanted to kind of give a brief overview of the Virginia Clean Economy Act, also known as VCEA. So in April of 2020, Governor Northam accelerated Virginia's transition to clean energy by signing the Virginia Clean Economy Act and by amending the Clean Energy and Community Flood Preparedness Act, which required Virginia to join RGGI, which is the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. The acts incorporate clean energy directions that Governor Northam issued in Executive Order 43 back in 2019. And this was the result of extensive stakeholder input and incorporates environmental justice concepts related to the Green New Deal. The law establishes renewable portfolio standards and required Dominion Energy to be 100% carbon-free by 2045, as well as Appalachian Power to be 100% carbon-free by 2050. It also required most Virginia coal and oil-fired steam plants to close by the end of 2024. The act also provided that 5,200 megawatts of generation is in the public interest, and that requires Dominion Energy to prioritize hiring local workers from historically disadvantaged communities to work with the Commonwealth to advance apprenticeship and job training and to include an environmental and fisheries mitigation plan. Again, this also kind of piggybacks off Heather's presentation where she was talking about the need for the just transition. And finally, it establishes that 16,100 megawatts of solar and onshore wind are in the public interest and expands net metering, making it easier for rooftop solar to advance across Virginia. And so I'll talk about the Virginia Integrated Resource Plan and how that was, put forth right after the Virginia Clean Economy Act, and then I'll go into the South Carolina Integrated Resource Plan. So the Virginia Integrated Resource Plan was filed on May 1st of 2020, and it incorporates Executive Order 43 as well as the Virginia Clean Economy Act, and that was driven by the company's commitment to net zero emissions by 2050. The 2020 IRP was intended to serve as a guide for potential investments in new electric generating resources, as well as power delivery infrastructure. And we included 5 plans in the Virginia IRP, including a least cost plan, which did not follow the VCEA, but was something that was ordered by our commission. The 4 other plans included investments of 16,000 megawatts, which is a combination of our self-build as well as power purchase agreements, the 5,000 megawatts of offshore wind, and the 2,700 megawatts of energy storage. And so you can see over the years how the additional solar capacity has kind of increased from the IRP that was presented back in 2019. And in Virginia, we will have an updated integrated resource plan that'll be filed in September of 2021. And now kind of going back to South Carolina. So our modified South Carolina integrated resource plan was filed on February 19th of this year. And the IRP, again, is it presents alternative plans to put the company on a trajectory to continue building a cleaner, more efficient, and lower carbon emitting utility while balancing customer affordability, system reliability, as well as generation diversity. I think when we think of, decarbonization, we want to ensure that not only are we lowering our emissions, but we're continuing to provide safe, reliable energy to our customers. To identify the best path forward for the system over the coming decade, Dominion Energy South Carolina analyzed 14 different generation resource plans. And those plans assumed the deployment of different combinations of new solar resources, new storage resources, and existing generating resources. 3 of the plans assumed the early retirement of existing coal or fossil steam units. And our resource plan 8 was the preferred plan and retires large coal plants before the end of the decade and adds a significant amount of solar. As you can see, there's currently, in the plan that we had filed back in February, we had about 973 megawatts of solar on our system. We are now currently over 1,000, but as you can see, we're continuing to grow. And from a perspective of how fast we've grown, in the summer of 2019, the nameplate capacity of utility scale solar generation on the Dominion Energy South Carolina system was approximately 485 megawatts. And then for the summer of 2020, the nameplate capacity of utility scale solar generation exceeded 800 megawatts, which was approximately a 75% increase year over year. And as I had mentioned earlier, as of May 31st of this year, we're over 1,000 megawatts of solar interconnected to our system with residential, commercial, industrial, utility scale, and community solar. And finally, when we kind of talk about how we operate in comparison to other utilities, Dominion Energy South Carolina ranks second among the 13 largest utilities in the Southeast with over 800 solar watts per customer, which is 2.5 times the average for the region. And then finally, I kind of wanted to talk about how embracing change is really a core tenet to Dominion. And we believe that, innovation is just part of our culture. And to the right, I've got a slide of an autonomous vehicle that we have operating in Northern Virginia. And so we believe that like the electric and the autonomous vehicles will play a major role in lowering emissions across the transportation sector. And again, when you looked at Heather's presentation, she highlighted the key sector contributing to emissions was transportation. So when you think of Dominion, it's not only our sustainability strategy doesn't only incorporate what we can do to lower our own emissions and the direct actions that we can take for our own direct use emissions, but also what we're doing to enable other sectors to decarbonize as well. So we're partnering with the Fairfax County to deploy an electric autonomous self-driving shuttle to provide that last mile transit in the busy Merrifield mixed use district. And this free relay shuttle, which holds up to 12 passengers, will make a loop between the metro station and the district to provide a convenient and zero emission transit option for shoppers, visitors, and businesses. In addition to providing a more environmentally friendly means of transportation, the shuttle service provides an exciting way for riders to support an innovative and emerging technology. One other key point is that the autonomous vehicles are actually safer as well. So this kind of supports our strategy of not only delivering clean, reliable, and affordable energy, but we want to make sure that it is safe as well. And so we're not only are we doing that for our own sector, but we're trying to make other sectors safer as well. one interesting stat that I had kind of come up or that I had found when researching all of the great things about our programs was that human error causes 94% of car crashes, according to the National Highway Transportation Safety Administration. And autonomous vehicles can reduce traffic accidents and make travel safer by taking over critical safety tasks prone to human error. So many European cities are already benefiting from autonomous electric shuttles, and Dominion Energy will continue to take a variety of steps to help consumers learn more about autonomous electric vehicles, and also learn more about how they can, the information they need in order to potentially switch from an internal combustion engine to an electric vehicle. So, for example, we're making it easier to learn about the benefits from a financial perspective as well as an environmental perspective of driving electric. Back in 2019, we launched an online education tool to help customers as they make the transition to electric transportation. Another key important aspect is it's important for Dominion Energy to optimize the electric grid to meet the increased demand from EV charging. So in Virginia, we recently received approval from the Smart Charging Infrastructure Pilot Program and requested regulatory approval of 2 additional customer-facing programs to support and encourage EV adoption while minimizing the impacts of EV charging on the grid. We continue to engage with other peers and research coalitions to advance global economy-wide decarbonization efforts. One example is the Low Carbon Resource Initiative, or better known as LCRI, and they're targeting advancements in low carbon electric generation technologies and low carbon energy carriers such as hydrogen, ammonia, synthetic fuels, and biofuels. This worldwide collaboration will identify and accelerate fundamental development of promising technologies and demonstrate and assess the performance of key technologies to inform key stakeholders and the public about those technology options and potential pathways to a low carbon future. And finally, Dominion Energy, we're planning to issue our next climate report next month. And that kind of has the deep scenario modeling analysis that Heather was referring to earlier about how we can get to 1.5 degrees or limit global warming to 1.5 degrees and achieve net zero emissions across our company by 2050. And this report is following the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. And some of you may have heard about this. There have been key support from international counterparties as well. So coming out of the G7 summit a few weeks ago, they had supported requiring companies to follow the TCFD framework. And so you'll be able to see more about our plans, our specific plans on decarbonizing our company, as well as all the efforts that we're doing outside to enable other sectors to decarbonize as well. And finally, there are sections on what we're doing from a just transition perspective and the legislative and regulatory policies, which will help aid our goal to net zero emissions by 2050. So hopefully I'm open to any other questions that people may have.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Zarin. We should be getting some in the chat.
All right, let's see. We've got a question from Nina. Can Dominion expand its solar and renewable portfolio while simultaneously promoting expansion in residential and commercial sectors?
So thank you, Christine. I think as we have talked about before, Dominion's focus is really on providing safe, reliable, affordable energy to all of our customers, and that includes clean energy. And so when you talk about how that can be processed through all stakeholders, we are looking at all of those options.
Okay. And another question from Belvin. Dominion recently proposed rate hikes for rooftop solar that would have decimated the industry here and lost us a lot of progress in renewable energy production. Thankfully, the proposed rates were not adopted by the PSC. Was this because the guaranteed rate of return on investment granted by the state, aka building new infrastructure capacity, equals guaranteed profit, doesn't apply to residential solar? How do you reconcile a stated commitment to renewable energy with your push against rooftop solar?
So I can get back to them on the details of that from a perspective of sustainability and our corporate-wide progress and strategy. We really focus on, clean, reliable, and affordable energy, and the multitude of ways that we can decarbonize our sector as well as our company.
Okay. How has the VCEA helped Dominion Energy in achieving its net zero commitment, and what recommendations would you have for South Carolina policymakers?
Thank you. I think that, from our perspective, the VCEA supported our net zero commitment, which was announced a few months before the bill was passed. And that was able to provide the necessary legislative support to develop the largest offshore wind project this side of the Atlantic. In addition, it provided like a clear timeline for adding additional zero carbon resources to our generation portfolio mix. So I can't emphasize how important it is for legislative and regulatory bodies to be on the same page. The more alignment you have, really the easier it is to provide and have that alignment in your integrated resource plans. So from my perspective, with respect to South Carolina policy, Dominion Energy supports policies that are technology agnostic and focusing on delivering clean, safe, reliable, and affordable energy to the customer it serves. So anything that we can have to promote, all green technology is definitely something that we support, and really providing us with all of the tools in the toolbox that we need to decarbonize.
I have a follow-up question from Nina. So how can South Carolina achieve similar performance to that of Dominion in Virginia?
I think when you look at the recently filed IRP, you can see the multitude of plans that have addressed decarbonization within them. And I think when you think of, as we talked earlier, the key is really ensuring that the policies and the legislative and the regulatory efforts are really driving in sync. The more alignment you have, the better off you are to be able to achieve our goals of decarbonization.
Okay. And Daniel asks, can you talk about some of the ways that Dominion in particular can do a better job working with the clean energy industry to continue building out a robust clean energy market in South Carolina, including resources not owned by the company? Let's see. We were thrilled that the Duke companies signed a landmark settlement with various clean energy organizations in South Carolina, but we're disappointed that Dominion chose a more litigated approach to the South Carolina NEM dockets.
So thank you, Christine. I will admit that is a little technical and out of my scope, but I can definitely follow up and get additional details on that.
All right.
I can, I'm gonna drop a quick link in the chat that kind of responds to Daniel's questions. It's also a little bit too in the weeds for me to answer, but I just wanted to throw a resource out there for people who are interested.
Oh, great. Thank you. Heather, did you have anything to add on any of these questions that we've been asking so far?
I don't think so. I'm gonna quickly scroll back up though and answer some of the questions I just typed out in the chat, because I think that there might be some people who may have joined by phone or something.
Great.
So Daniel asked, how did SAE source projected emissions through 2030 based on proposed policy? Is this original analysis done by SAE based on filed IRPs, or was this data for the region sourced elsewhere? So I think I forgot to mention this, but like kind of a key component of the emissions figures that I showed you guys is that it's tied directly to the capacity and generation figures that the utilities are filing with the integrated resource plans. So it's kind of just a good distinction of like, this is, you know, what they're saying. And then we use some fuel use data and emissions factors from EIA and EPA to translate those into emissions figures. And so we actually recently released a report kind of looking at those emissions figures for various utilities in the Southeast that have net zero goals. We actually didn't go into super detail about Dominion in this year's report. We were mostly focusing on the utilities that have multiple operating companies in multiple states, like Duke and Southern Company and NextEra and TVA. But I think next year probably we hope to include them more.
Yeah, that was a great webinar you all had earlier this morning.
Thanks. Yeah, we have another one in an hour. Oh.
Yeah, y'all are doing a lot to get the word out, so we really appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem.
And giving us information that is, you know, incredibly useful, I think, for policymakers and for, you know, anyone buying energy today. So Zarin, I was wondering with Dominion, what is Dominion doing to help public entities, you know, go green? And, you know, public entities, it's much more difficult for us because we don't get tax breaks for solar and renewables. Is there any information you can give us on that?
Yeah, so I can definitely follow up with you on that, but I know that we have, you know, entered into green renewable PPAs with our customers, and it really depends on the different jurisdiction that you're in, based off the tariffs and the programs that are offered from a regulatory perspective. But again, I can follow up on the specific ones for South Carolina.
Okay, great. Thank you. Well, we have one more minute, and I want to respect everyone's time, especially Heather, since you've got another webinar to do. So thank you, everyone, for coming today. Thank you, Zarin, and thank you, Heather. Thank you, Rachel. Really appreciate the information. Thank you all for your great questions in the chat. And next month, we'll be back here online talking about heat in South Carolina and the health consequences of how hot it is getting. So I hope to see you all next month. Thank you all for coming today.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Thanks.
Bye.